Hello, Asia Society Hong Kong. Welcome to UCCA Edge here in Shanghai. I'm Philip Tinari, Director of UCCA and actually a longtime member of the Asia Society Hong Kong Center Gallery Committee. And it's really great to have you here for this virtual tour. UCCA Edge is UCCA's presence in Shanghai. It was opened in May of this year. It occupies 3 floors of a new tower that was developed by KWA, a developer you may know from Hong Kong. And it's operated in partnership between UCCA and KWA. And this is actually our 3rd exhibition. We opened in May with a show about the year 2000 and its impact on global contemporary art in China through the prism of that year's Shanghai Biennale. And we followed that with an exhibition of Liu Xiaodong's paintings this past summer. So Becoming Andy Warhol was a collaboration between UCCA and the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. It contains nearly 400 objects that give us a very comprehensive portrait of Warhol from his earliest days in Pittsburgh to his final years in New York. And I'll be walking you through this exhibition together with Ara Chiu, who is a curator here at UCCA Edge and who was responsible for this presentation here. The show, however, was curated by Patrick Moore, director of the Andy Warhol Museum, and Jose Carlos Diaz, who is the chief curator at the Andy Warhol Museum. And I think what's interesting to us is that having this show in 2 different cities, but also in 2 different buildings and venues, really showcases the work in an entirely different light. In Beijing, we were in a big open factory space where we had to do a lot of construction to create rooms. And here we have a much more urban situation with views out back onto the Shanghai skyline, more compressed and more almost traditional gallery-like spaces. We hope you'll enjoy. Thanks for being with us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to UCCA Edge here in rainy Shanghai. This is the opening day of Becoming Andy Warhol. I'm the director of UCCA, Philip Tinari.
And I'm UCCA curator, Ara Chiu.
And this exhibition was created together with the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, curated by Patrick Moore, the director there, and Jose Cruz Diaz, the chief curator there. Unfortunately, because of the ongoing pandemic situation, our colleagues from the Andy Warhol Museum weren't able to join us in either Beijing or Shanghai, but that leaves the 2 of us to take you on a bit of a walk through this exhibition. So come right this way. So the first section is called Origins, right? And it's really, well, how would you describe it?
It's early years of Andy Warhol, depicting his kind of college life and his hometown Pittsburgh, and also the first few years in New York.
It's true, yeah. We have even a painting by his friend Philip Pearlstein, who he went to art school with, and we have all kinds of materials that show you, his high school yearbook, maps of the neighborhood where he grew up, and we really get a sense of him as the child of Eastern European immigrants from modern-day Slovakia, who goes on to become this amazing artist. And then we come into this next section.
Yeah, I think this origin, kind of this orange room depicting his mother is also very interesting for the audience.
Yes, totally. No, his relationship with his mother is such a special theme that goes through his whole career. And this vitrine here, we have her photo, and we also have some of her drawings, right? And of course, she was the person behind the calligraphy and the commercial art that he was doing.
Yes, and there is such a deep relationship between Andy and his mother.
It's true. So we're really seeing here, this is the period between 1949 and 1959 when he's making his way as a commercial illustrator, finding himself as an openly gay man in New York of that time. And I think coming to be noticed for this blotted line style and its sensitivity and sensibility, especially about, for example, shoes. Really just some wonderful stuff. This is a series of work he did for a fur merchant, right?
Yes, and he quickly got exposed in New York as a commercial artist. And I think the first 10 years was his kind of golden years in commercial arts.
It's true. And then we come into a new section, which is talking
Andy as a photographer.
As a photographer, exactly. And he was a photographer. I mean, this is something people maybe don't realize quite the extent, right? I mean, I think you read accounts of the time and people talk about how he always had a camera.
Yes, process, and photography is always a very important aspect in his creating.
True. I mean, the silkscreen paintings, they come from photographs and go through a whole process of transfer to become the finished product. But at the same time, he was also doing things like just recording the world around him, whether that was these everyday objects and forms, things like bathrooms and sinks, or whether it was these, as we'll see upstairs, these famous friends and glamorous scenes that he found himself in.
Here we come to the cinema as object section, which is we create this silver kind of factory vibe in our galleries.
And I think one thing that's so much fun about the show is throughout you have interspersed these different tools he was using. So this is the Polaroid big shot camera, right? Which is the source of so much of his photographic imagery.
And here is so many documenting kind of photos of Andy as a director and a film producer in the 80s and 70s.
And we have, photographers who were making these images. Even someone like Stephen Shore, who goes on to become quite an important photographer in his own right, was then someone around the studio, around the factory. Mm-hmm. And later in the 80s, he starts to experiment even with television, right? This is Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes. We see Michael Chow was actually the subject of a show at UCCA a number of years ago.
Yeah, and he always embraced new medias, and also we can see 5 of the screens hanging above us.
Yes. So here we are on the 3rd floor, the most compact of the levels, and we immediately encounter these stitched photographs.
Yeah, they're very rare to see, actually.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting to see him playing with seriality as always, but also with the materiality of photographic prints and kind of binding them together in this new way.
Kind of gave it kind of a sculpture style of the photos.
I also love this room. This is really where we see how he used photography to document his social life, essentially.
Kind of a photo diary.
It's like Instagram before Instagram in a way, right? I mean, you really get this hanging out with Bianca Jagger and Dolly and Cher and Liza Minnelli. I mean, it's really like a who's who of a golden age of New York. We even have Henry Kissinger over here, which is with Elizabeth Taylor.
And we all know Andy had this kind of party always going on in New York in the 60s.
And I mean, into the 70s and 80s even with Studio 54 and all these other things. So.
And I think the photo in 1982, this one is especially interesting.
No, this is really important for our audience. This is his visit to Beijing. After his trip to Hong Kong, and he's having his tourist photo taken in front of Tiananmen Square, just like an ordinary tourist.
And he with his very good friends, and they visited a few tourist spots in Beijing.
Yeah, it's a colored photograph from Tiananmen Square. You said he received it a few months later.
Received it sent from Beijing, actually. Yeah.
Fascinating. Which is a nice segue into this section, which is about portraiture. And of course, one thing we're talking about is how he went about making these portraits that we know so well. But we really start from his self-portrait, right, from 1964 or so.
Mm-hmm. You will see this is the original Polaroid photo of the portraits. Yeah. And then he picked one and made the screen print. And here you can see the process of the whole series.
This, I think, very appropriately became our key image, sort of poster for the show, because this is really about how he decided to present himself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And photos always be a very important part of the screen print process. And here we kind of showcasing all the different steps of how you can make one of Andy Warhol's screen print.
Yeah, no, here, I mean, this is really where we get the example of, this is Jane Fonda, right? So we go from the Polaroid, to the acetate, to the outline, and finally to the finished painting.
Yeah, this is the whole process of how Andy made these happen.
Great, shall we continue? So here we are in one of my favorite parts of the building. This is this staircase which connects the third and fourth floor.
And here you will find Andy's famous town wallpapers around us.
So I love this section. It's called Warhol Remixed, and I think, what I find so interesting in the curatorial concept is that, of course we all know the Campbell soup cans when he first did them in the 60s, but maybe we don't know that he did them again in the 80s.
Yeah.
Same with Coke, same with Brillo, same with all of these different elements, right?
Yeah, and we will see the difference between the early days Campbell to the late days Campbell's. There is so many differences to tell. Yeah, so from the abstract kind of way to the very commercial kind of screen print, the very flat kind of style.
Yeah, I mean, we really have 30 years of work surrounding us from actually very different periods in his life, but constantly returning to these same themes. And of course, this is the Warhol that people maybe think of when they think of him. But let's keep going and see what we find. Yeah, our friend Marilyn. And then works that actually very directly address commercial brands, which he made quite late. These are from 1985, looking at Chanel. And then a brief pause as we find the entrance to our sculpture terrace here, and we will give the viewers a moment to catch their breath as we come around and end up in what's really the final section of the show.
The immaterial, the late years of Andy Warhol as an artist and as a human being.
Yeah, I love this section. I think there's just so much here. You see him really confronting his own mortality, and especially in Shanghai, we get this pairing that we didn't have in Beijing, the fright wig next to the skulls. Mm-hmm. Actually, the curator of this exhibition has just curated a show in Brooklyn about Warhol's Catholicism. And we see a lot of this kind of religious imagery there too. Yeah. But also things like, another great pairing, camouflage and Rorschach. Warhol very famously was not interested in abstraction, but here we have two different kinds of abstract patterns that actually have very concrete meanings in life and in society.
It's kind of abstraction but figurative. Kind of combine these two kind of threads.
Right, and then a room that I think a lot of people will be taking photos of here in Shanghai with the dollar sign, which is also an abstraction in its own way.
Yeah.
And here we have a special space which we're going to use for people can film their own screen tests.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you can join our workshop downstairs, and your photos of the screen tests will be showing here. And also you can listen to the music related to Andy Warhol in this special room.
And then we come back into this slate section. We see things like these layered self-portraits, but also this series of myths that he made, looking at these different figures that exist in these mythological ways as part of the American mindset. Mm-hmm. And that brings us, to this last room. I mean, it's a circle, so there's really no beginning and no end. But it's, I think it's just anyway. It's a totally different experience from Beijing, of course, where you were in this kind of big industrial hall and it was so monumental. I think here it's much more urban. It's much more compact, and it's quite.
And the three kind of layers of the galleries just bring you step by step into Andy's life.
Good. Well, we hope that was informative and that you'll consider, if you're in Shanghai, coming by. The show will be up until
March the 6th
of 2022. Thanks again to all of our friends and supporters. Thanks, of course, to the Andy Warhol Museum, and we hope to see you in Shanghai.